Welcome everyone, well arrived. Today is the camera fell behind the PC and I can't be bothered to set it up properly Tuesday. What we have for today is an interesting question, an interesting debate. I would like to hear your opinion on this because I just noticed this happening and I was curious to see how the player base will react to this change. So by now, by this time in the release of the expansion, last expansion in Shadowlands, we were roughly right into November, just like now, 2 years ago. The expansion was coming on in about 20 days, just like 2 years ago, and there was a major difference. This was the major difference. The difference was that back then, at this point, players were able to see simulations. They were able to see the predictions of how the specs were going to perform, how good the specs were going to be. So you had already an idea. All of the new players, all of the returning players, newcomers, as well as old-time WoW players, perhaps they started watching streams, they started watching YouTube videos, getting excited about the expansion and interested in knowing from beta players, from experienced players, from theory crafters, just how the specs were looking. Because of course, if you plan, for example, on raiding, if you plan on doing Mythic Plus, you want to be at the very least sure, perhaps not to be a flavor of the month or a meta chaser, but at the very least to play a spec that is not completely dead, right? So they of course started looking at the classic menu of tier lists and rankings and charts and top tier specs in all the roles, just to get an idea of how strong the specs were in the upcoming expansion. We move on 2 years later and we are almost in Dragonflight. We are about 20 days away from the expansion and we find ourselves with a big change. The big change is that at the moment there are basically no working sims. Raid bots and by extension simulation craft, even the more custom-made simulation craft strings for each of the specs are not even there. There is perhaps maybe 2 or 3 specs that have been trying to use simulation craft out of the 38 specs available and the 25 DPS specs available. So we are in a situation that as we get into the expansion, as players start asking, what do I play? Which spec is strong? Which is going to be meta? I want to try to play healer in Mythic Plus next expansion. What should I play to be accepted into groups, to be wanted by groups? We have the situation where we just don't know. That is a massive difference compared to what we had in the release of Shadowlands, where thanks to simulations and thanks to being able to see already before the expansion, we could tell, for example, that at the time the strongest ranged DPS specs were Fire Mage, Balanced Druid and Marksmanship Hunter. We had the sims, we had the receipts, we had the data that could tell us that that was going to be a thing. Same goes for the melee DPS, same goes for the healers and same goes for the tanks. Which is exactly why at the release of Shadowlands you had a population like this one. How did all the players know to go play Mage, to go play Unholy Death Knight, to go play Marksmanship or to go play Holy Paladin or to play Vengeance Demon Hunter? They knew because they got to know it from the beta. It's not that specs like Vengeance Demon Hunter or Unholy Death Knight were particularly popular before the release of Shadowlands, so that happened because players got to know before the release of the expansion which specs were likely going to be powerful. So what is the solution now? What is the answer if we don't know for sure from the simulations which specs are going to be strong? Well, you know, it's not that the only thing you have to be able to see what is going to be popular and powerful is simulations. You have also the players themselves. You don't have to resort just to numbers, just to an AI computing calculations for you. You have Mythic Plus testable in the beta. You have the raids testable in the beta. So you can still have a few ways to test the actual performance of the specs. But for healers, and more importantly for the DPS, which is ultimately, as we know, the most popular, the most played of the roles, that is much harder to guess. Without the simulations working, without knowing precisely what is the, let's just say, the maximum potential of a spec played at basically perfect level, without that, it is going to be much harder to know what is going to be popular, which is very strange, right? as WoW player base, it's a very strange feeling to get into, for example, a new big patch or a new big expansion without knowing for sure what is going to be the strong one, what is going to be the OP pick as a role. We do know of course very well that the player base is going to have no problem whatsoever re-rolling out of nowhere as long as they know the spec is going to be popular and powerful. Just see, for example, how underplayed a spec like Survival was. Ever since its inception in Legion, and then into BFA, and then into the first 2 seasons of Shadowlands, Survival was constantly at the bottom 3 least played specs. And then all of a sudden, as the patch comes through, as the double legendary is active together with the buff of the tier sets combining together, they made Survival a very powerful spec, which ended up being one of the more popular of the specs and the strongest of the melee picks in Mythic Plus, for example. This is something that is not going to be available at the release of Dragonflight. You can only guess, because we will be indeed lacking critical information for knowing exactly how the spec's damage is looking before a release of an expansion. So this was the question I wanted to put forth for today, because some players might like this situation and other players might not like this situation. So the difference between getting into an expansion knowing before the expansion releases, so having time, for example, in the pre-patch to start leveling up and gearing up multiple characters, the ones that you know you want to play for the expansion, and then knowing, not for sure, okay, it's not a 100% chance, but at the very least a 70 to 80% chance that you know after listening to streams, listening to YouTube videos, that they all told you this spec is going to be strong, this spec is going to be strong, you know, pick this spec to be meta in Mythic Plus, so you can know with a decent chance of success that the spec is going to be good, so you can get ready for it. And then you have the other side, which is the Dragonflight side, where without simulations, without data about how the specs are performing, and only, you know, feelings, right, guesses and hunches about specs, you are much less likely to be guaranteed to be playing a spec that is going to be meta. For example, at the moment, we don't know if Fire Mage is going to be very, very strong compared to Affliction Warlock, compared to Elemental Shaman, compared to Shadow Priest. Even with the discussions about how the talents are working, if the talent trees are satisfying or not, in the end, it matters nothing when it comes to actual damage. It's not that the prettier, the cooler, and the smoother a talent tree is, the more damage the spec will do. That's not at all. We have seen multiple times several specs having brain dead rotations with 3 buttons, not being cool to play or enjoyable whatsoever, still being very, very good in the meta. So even looking at the talents themselves, even mocking Shadow Priest for having a shitty talent tree doesn't mean that Shadow Priest won't be a very, very good spec in terms of numbers. So those are the two sides that we are at currently. Whether or not you enjoy a situation before an expansion where you can tell more clearly which spec could be the popular one. So if you, for example, cared a lot about raiding, if you cared a lot about Mythic Plus, you could know a little bit better beforehand if you wanted to focus on these activities, which of the specs you wanted to play, or the current situation, the Dragonflight situation, which is more of a question mark. It is more of a, I am not sure, I have to roll a dice, I have to guess, I have to try to listen to the hunches of some of the players or the hunches of the content creators that tell me which spec is going to be good. It is not going to be nearly as certain. As I said, before the release of Shadowlands, there were very few doubts about which of the specs were going to be meta, because of the amount of data, the amount of testing we had in the beta itself that gave us an idea of what was going to be powerful. This is not currently present in Dragonflight, and this has to do a lot with the way talents are going to work, because there are so many iterations of talents, because there are so many different options and different choices you can make in the talents. It is currently proving quite difficult to get simulations up and running for all of the specs. Of course, you still have some data, you still have some numbers coming from particularly coming from Mythic Plus keys, so you can tell already that, for example, as we saw, Windwalker Monk and Enhancement Shaman were doing the most DPS, so you already know that Windwalker is doing more AoE DPS damage than Arms is doing more AoE DPS damage than Red Paladin. You already know that tanks, as I said, are clearer, are a little bit easier to guess. Protection Warrior, Blood Death Knight, and Vengeance Demon Hunter at the moment are the 3 tanks doing the best compared to all of the others. You do know a few things, but definitely nowhere near as much of a certainty as we had before in previous expansions. And some players might not enjoy it, because they are more worried about being meta, they are more worried about being than they are about picking the most enjoyable spec, the most fun spec to play or whatnot, since for them a lot of the fun comes from being viable in the activity they want to partake in the raid or in Mythic Plus or even in PvP. So that is the question for today. Which situation would you rather be in? Would you rather enjoy a situation like Shadowlands or even like PFA or even like Legion, where thanks to the simulations, thanks to the data coming from the beta, we could know much more clearly which specs were going to be powerful? So the chances of hitting the jackpot with a flavor of the month spec as your main was very high. Or if you would rather enjoy a situation like right now, where most of it is going to be a coin toss, most of it is going to be like having a hunch, you know, deciding mostly on gut feeling which spec looks the best. As I said, the gut feeling, it can still be there, you can still take some general decisions, like at the moment definitely I am leaning more towards having Mage being viable than Red Paladin, or Warlock being viable than Shadow Priest, or Rogue being viable than Evoker, simply because those are the pure DPS classes. They have 3 different specs to choose from, so you are gonna have a much higher chance to at the very least pick one of the 3 to be powerful. This is a classic bonus, a classic benefit of the pure DPS classes, to give you more chances at being good in at least one of them. So that is perhaps something that might come back in handy in this expansion, given that we don't know quite for certain which specs are looking very good or clearly very good and the best picks for this expansion. So I am leaving you on this Tuesday with this dilemma: which of the 2 types of releases of an expansion would you rather have when it comes to choosing a main to play for an expansion? I am going to leave the rest of the thoughts for you guys. For now, we can stop this video right here. Thanks, of course, as usual, to all of my Patreon supporters for contributing and for being a big support on what allows me to continue to provide you all with WoW content. You can still, if you don't want to abuse your wallet, support in other ways, which don't include spending gold, which include liking and commenting down below, all in the favor of the YouTube algorithm gods, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Lastly, for more social interactions and general parasocial relationships, you can follow me on Twitter, as well as subscribing to my Patreon right like there at those 2 links. Thank you guys again for watching. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, well, you see, it's like it's too far away. I can't reach it properly, so it had to stay there. Goodbye.